It would come, I think, as a surprise to some people to know that you don't already have a right to have a bank account in this country, because not having one means you really can't function barely in society anymore.
Well, that's right. I mean, we used to have a right. When before we privatised the post office, we had that right because the government could insist that anybody could at least have a post office account. I mean, not very sophisticated, but at least they had an account. You're right. I mean, the ability of banks to stop your account, to debank you, was not widely known. I mean, I first raised it 2 years ago with another victim, suffered really in a similar way to the way Nigel Farage did. But unlike Nigel, he didn't want his name in the public domain. Unlike Nigel, he wasn't willing to put up a really serious public fight, and so we couldn't do anything about that. I couldn't move the government. I couldn't move the banks. But once they did it to Nigel, well, of course, they bit off more than they could chew. And what the world at large is now clear on is that banks can arbitrarily cut off your banking services, and that, as you say, is quite wrong. I mean, we're shutting ticket offices, railway ticket offices now. You can't even buy a train ticket if you haven't got a credit card or a bank account of some sort now to do it online. So the sheer size of online transactions, the sheer reduction in the use of cash, all of the social trends mean we really have to have a bank account to operate a normal life, and therefore people should have that right.
So, David, talk us through for the layperson how the private members bill works, and how likely is this to be mandated into British law?
Careful, you'll lose most of your audience through this, but very, very quickly. We have a ballot for private members' bills each year. You can win that. There are some ways of taking what's called a 10-minute rule bill and carrying it through if everybody supports it. So those are the sort of two big mechanisms. If that doesn't work, you can tack something on to a piece of government legislation that exists already. Although, of course, the ideal, and I'm sort of hoping that they'll give in. The ideal is the government picks it up and actually does it itself. So there are three strands you can pursue, and I will pursue all of them until we get what we want.
And why might they not do that, David? Given that we've just said how important it is, what might the resistance be from the government?
Well, there have been a variety of back pressures. I mean, I think in the middle of June, Claire Fox tried to move a motion which would do away with what they call the issue of politically exposed persons. That's people like me, or indeed like Nigel, who have had political influence or have political influence, and the idea that they shouldn't be able to have bank accounts without very strict controls because they might be bribed. So that was what she tried to get changed, and there was back pressure, and I understand the back pressure came from the Home Office, well, specifically from MI5 and the police forces, because they saw that this was a weapon for them in the fight against international crime. But it's a very, very crude weapon, a very heavy-handed weapon. So that's one reason. Second reason is, of course, don't underestimate the banks themselves. They have huge influence in government. They have access to the Treasury and so on. And the Treasury doesn't want to upset them or damage them, or indeed undermine our own banking capabilities. But nearly every other country has this right. France, for example, if you live in France, you've got a right to a bank account. I think there's no overwhelming reason. There might be a lot of inertia, a lot of hesitation, but frankly, if they're faced with the option of me moving a private member's bill or doing it themselves, they might think it's the easier thing to do it themselves.
Yeah, David, what's been fantastic about this campaign, Nigel utilising GB News to force political change. Thank you for taking this up on behalf of Nigel, but not just Nigel, because we saw initially it was like, well, it's Nigel Farage, who cares? And now we saw Gina Miller, the arch Remainer, Grant Shapps, of course. So this is now across the political spectrum. But David, a more concerning thing for me is the emergence of thousands of small business people having their accounts frozen out. What I want to ask you, as part of GB News' Don't Kill Cash campaign, I'm hearing that people that are trading in cash are looked upon in an unsatisfactory way by banks because they want cash cash to die out. They're closing thousands of banks. Is this, you think, the weaponisation of closing down bank accounts, part of the banks are raising cash from the way we trade?
I'm not sure. I think that there are two different things going on there. And look, you can see from the point of view of the banking sector, the point of view of the sort of large corporate sector, not having to deal with cash saves them money. It saves them having to go through all the issues of having transport arrangements, having safes and so on, tills and the rest. So you can see why it's much cheaper. So I think that's a straightforward economic pressure more than anything else. I mean, I don't like the idea of doing away with cash because at the end of the day, cash is an anonymous medium. If I buy something with a credit card or I buy something with anything else, it tells all sorts of people what I'm doing. Now, it doesn't matter in my case; it's pretty much public domain. But lots of people might want to keep their privacy. So I think actually the removal of cash got all sorts of other problems associated with it. But you're quite right. The removal of cash means the denial of a bank account is a destroying measure. It's something which can completely wreck your business. I mean, there have been, by the way, it's not thousands. I think it's tens of thousands. Nigel has shown today it's about 1,000 a day. So you're talking tens of thousands of small businesses, and they're just completely destroyed by this. Big ones can sort of find a way around it, but small ones, what do you do if suddenly you can no longer pay the bills, you can no longer receive money by bank transfer and so on? You're out of business. You're dead. So
we know,
I think the removal of cash makes this a lethal action.
David, Rishi Sunak, even before he was Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak was incredibly excited by the idea of central banking digital currencies. He is a technocrat at heart. We know that his number two, Jeremy Hunt, is very keen on the way that China often runs life out there. Do you think that you are the exception amongst the people in the Conservative Party who think like that, in wanting to keep cash? What does Rishi Sunak think? Does he want to keep cash?
Well, I think Rishi is a fan of digital cash, and in that, I think he's wrong. Frankly, I think the risks with digital cash are really, really quite serious. But he was a chancellor. He's surrounded by people for whom this makes life a bit more convenient. One of the great pressures in modern life is that convenience overcomes really important traditional rights, whether it's privacy or whether it's independence or whether it, all these things. So I'm afraid I think both. I think Rishi's wrong in that respect. I think what will happen as people discover some of the weaknesses and problems of digital currency is they'll pull back and realise that it's a dangerous mechanism by itself. Anyway, if you allow it by itself. So I'm afraid it's one area where I disagree with our Prime Minister.
Good for you.
Yeah, and, we've seen this moving from politics, David, into banks spying on people's social media feeds. Rank and file members of the public having their social media feeds, their Facebook accounts, their Twitter accounts monitored by banks, an insidious attack on free speech as well as the financial aspect, Mr. Davis.
This is one of the reasons, incidentally, that GB News is so important. Because a lot of the people doing this won't think they're being prejudiced. They're surrounded by a single view of the world, right? We see this in everything, whether it's Brexit or woke issues or whatever. They see this single view of the world and think anybody outside it is somehow strange or extreme. And one of the great things that the introduction of GB News has done is said, no, there are a lot of very, very sensible people who disagree with you, take a different view. And, what we're trying to do, what Nigel's trying to do, is to break that single grip on public opinion, and successfully, I think. It's one of the reasons that you've overtaken Sky and other people. It's because you're actually reflecting what real people actually think.